Okay, hi everybody. At this stage, I'm just going to show you how the pewtercaster works. So, in order to use the pewtercaster, first off, you'll need a visor to protect your face. It does say low temperature casting system on the machine, but the low temperature is still very high temperature. It's the metal melts at about 250 degrees C, which is about your oven at its hottest. Now, obviously, if for whatever reason the metal splashed because it's molten liquid metal, it could obviously splash and then go on your face and your eyes or anything. So obviously you want to cover your entire face to make sure that none of your face gets burnt. You also need leather gloves. Now leather is a lot thicker material, so the metal can't get through the leather. So if metal drops on or splashes onto the leather gloves, then it won't affect it. It will just roll off. And same thing here, we've got a leather apron, so for exactly the same reason. In industry, they would wear leather leggings as well, which basically is just a leather cover for your legs to protect your legs. But in this situation, it's very low risk, so you're just going to use a regular, just use your regular trousers, should be fine for that. You also need leather shoes. Again, if anything spills on your shoes, you don't want the metal to be able to go through your shoes. And you've just got to be really careful around this machine. This top bit is obviously the lid. Now this is where you put the metal into. Now if metal goes into that section, it melts and it comes out of this part here, out of this little funnel here. Okay. Now, if any water gets into this top section when the metal is being heated up and turned into liquid, then it reacts violently. So you've got to make sure no water goes near that top section. And obviously you've got to be very careful around the machine. You'll also find a white line around the machine to say stay out of this section, just in case the metal splashes or anything when someone's using it and you're not protected. Obviously you've got to make sure that you are. So all people who aren't using the machine and haven't got all the safety gear on needs to make sure that they are protected and not inside that parameter. Okay, now if you have a look at the mold here, what I've got is, just rewind it back a little bit. It back a bit. So there's three sections. There's the section that's open, which your metal's going to pour into with a funnel just there. You got the piece which has got the engraving on, which is going to have to be lined up with the gap. And then I've got a blanking piece that stops the metal from coming out in the other direction. So when I line these up, let's make sure that they're perfectly lined up with each other so that you can see the engraving is clear. And then hold it tightly together. And then I'm going to use masking tape. It's got to be masking tape. Well, it can be, you can clamp it together just with small clamps. But the problem with the small clamps is they struggle to get into the gap. So if you tightly wrap masking tape around about 2 or 3 times, it should hold it, but it does hold it in place well enough that it will hold the pieces tightly together. Now it's important that you double check your mold that there are no gaps between the pieces of wood, because if there's any gaps, the metal will pour through. So you've just got to make sure it's really tightly masking tape together. So you go around a couple of times, but really try to do it nice and tight so it doesn't come through the gap. Don't use sellotape, because sellotape will melt when it gets very hot, so it could then come apart easily. So it has to be masking tape, because the paper doesn't struggle as much with the heat and it won't come apart. Okay. Now the next stage is, obviously you can see me putting on my safety gear, leather gloves, and the mask. Now you'll notice one other thing, there's loads of splash marks around the outside, and sometimes it drips out. It's not particularly very good designed system in some ways, because the little stopper that blocks the metal from coming out does sometimes get blocked and it drips out, and you can see it splashes sometimes onto the side. So that's another reason why you've got to be very careful around it in case it splashes and burns you. Now at this stage, there's a little handle just here on the right hand side. Now when I pull that handle down, it works like a lever. When you pull that down, it then lifts up like a plug inside here. So pull down and it levers up this section and lets the metal pour out. And you can see, if I pull that lever, you can see it dripping out. When it gets full, you'll see me tapping it gently on the side, and that removes any air bubbles that you might get into it. Now, what happens sometimes is the metal ends up dropping down because you've had air bubbles inside it, and because the air bubbles have now gone, the metal can get into those gaps. And when that happens, you then need to put a little bit more metal into it. Tapping it for a while just to make sure all air bubbles are out. And then just fill it up a little bit more if needed, and then just tap again to make sure that it's all full. Next thing to do is I'm just going to leave it somewhere for it to set. Now, it usually sets within a minute, so it sets solid within a minute. Or the longer you leave it, the better. It gives time for the molecules to align, and it makes a much stronger metal keyring. But a couple of minutes is probably enough. Now, after a couple of minutes, it's still going to be very, very hot. So you will need to still make sure that you're very careful around it because the metal will get very hot. Okay, thank you for watching that stage.